Hi, good evening. Welcome back to my daily shows, which this is day 29 of 30 days. One more day to my end. I'm, as I said last night, going to be carrying on doing some shows on a regular basis, but this is my daily challenge is going to be over. And tonight I just want to pick up again on on storytelling and just look a little bit at some of the theory stuff. Stuart, hi, good to see you tonight. Um, just join me as I'm starting talking about storytelling. So, um, it doesn't matter whether you're doing it for speaking, it doesn't matter whether you're doing it because you want to do this to get the story across for your business. That there's some elements to storytelling which need to be there, that need to work. And if you can put those on there, it really will give a good structure to your story. Getting a good structure to the story is really critical to making the whole thing work. Now, the essence of a great story, one that's going to be compelling, it's going to draw people in, is that there has to be some conflict. Somebody wants something, has difficulty getting it. Now, you can make the if you're telling a business story, you can make the protagonist can be your customers, can be people you know. More often than not, when I'm doing a story, yeah, it's me who's the protagonist. I'm telling a story, and it's about my life. It's about my circumstances, and I'm going to show some kind of conflict which I've had to overcome, because that's what makes a good story. That's what gets the audience on your side and thinking about it. So there's a protagonist. Every story has to have a protagonist. Every story also has to have an antagonist. An antagonist is, well, the opposite of the protagonist. It's the bad guy. It's the evil, the Doctor No from the James Bond, first James Bond movie. So yeah, if you think about the James Bond, James Bond is the protagonist, and there's always a Bond villain, the antagonist, the person who's creating the conflict, creating the difficulties. The antagonist doesn't necessarily have to be an individual person. It might be a monster. It might be some, if you think of all the monster movies, it can be, Freddy Krueger. Those are the antagonists. It's the villain. It's the tax man. It's the whatever it is that's going to cause the problem and bring about the problem. It's whoever you're fighting against. Yeah, in Star Wars, it's not just the Emperor. It's the whole the dark side that you're fighting. That's yes. In fact, the whole thing tends to be a battle between the the Jedi's and the dark side. But yeah, so every story has those essential elements: a protagonist, somebody who wants something, has difficulty getting it, there's some conflict, and there's something stopping him. That's the antagonist, and that's really the essence of looking at a good story. So you can tell anecdotes and short little stories, but if you want something that's going to draw people in and make them think about it, that's what you need. I remember working with somebody a few years ago who was doing a speech for one of her clients. Her clients were walled breweries, and I was coaching her to try and help her to find a good story. She was doing a speech at a food fair. And what had happened for walled breweries, they were a typical Yorkshire farm up here in near Hull, and they had got hit badly in 2001 by the foot and mouth disease, lost all of their livestock, and they were sitting there thinking, what do we do next? Because it cost them an enormous amount of money. They'd lost everything, and it wasn't just the fact that they lost the livestock. It wasn't just about going out and buying new cattle. It was actually about the challenge of rebuilding that livestock, which they'd had which had taken them years and years to build up and improve. And so that was the conflict they were facing. How did they overcome this? How did they get the farm to survive when it had been wiped out by foot and mouth? Now, they also grew barley, and they also had on their farm natural spring water coming up from the walls. And they suddenly thought, well, we've got the barley, we've got the spring water, all we need is the hops, which we can get from Kent. Why don't we make our own beer instead of using the barley for other people? And that's what they did. They started to create a small brewing, a small brewery in one of their barns, set it up, produced some extremely good beer, and went on to win some awards. And when I got to involvement, they had about, I think it was 4 or 5 different beers. And we looked at each of those beers and created an individual story for each of them, which made them compelling products worth purchasing. Because that was a pure business story, but it had the essence of conflict in it. They had a big challenge they had to overcome. As a result of overcoming that, they came out with a great beer. And there was a lot of lessons along the way in learning how to turn what was essentially a hobby into a now thriving business. So that's the essence you've got to look at. Now, I've talked about Aristotle before. Aristotle was the great forefather of, he was the first real teacher of storytelling. And I talked about his idea of, ethos, logos and pathos, credibility, facts and figures, and passion, that are the elements of good storytelling. But he also had a basic structure, which he simply referred to as pity, fear, and catharsis. At the start of your story, you need to create pity. You need to create empathy. The audience needs to feel empathy with the protagonist. Then you need to take your protagonist into an area. This is, your hero has got to face challenges, face some threats. That's bringing about the fear. And as the protagonist goes through that and meets the fear head on, and in a big story, it might be a full life or death conflict, and comes out of that having won, and that's the sense of catharsis. So pity, fear, catharsis. And that's the simple structure of the story, which actually is a 3-act play. The basic structure which has been used for thousands of years as the structure for basic storytelling. Act 1 is our setup. It takes about 25% of the play. It's the simple introduction. It sets up the play. It sets up the story. We get to know what's going on, and then we hit that first element of conflict. We're introduced to the conflict, and this is plot point 1. Plot point 1 is the point at which our hero knows he has to go and confront this challenge. And he's got to go do it. And then we get into Act 2, which Act 2 is a sequence of confrontations, often failing, often falling down, often having challenges. And we then get to the midpoint. We're exposing all the flaws. We've got to see our character as human. Nobody wants a perfect hero. People need to be human. You need to be able to empathize and think, oh my God, yeah, I've been there. I know that. And the midpoint is the point at which our hero has a moment of needing of turnaround, and that often comes with the introduction of a guide, a mentor, somebody he connects with, or she connects with, that's going to take them a further step on the journey. If you think about Star Wars, it's the introduction of Obi-Wan Kenobi, or it's the introduction of Yoda. But somewhere along the line, there is going to be some help, some consultation, attending a conference, a lesson being learned. A child may be the conveyor of information, but somewhere along the line, somebody gives the information which the protagonist needs in order to turn things around and start to get the better of the conflict, the antagonist. And then finally we come to the end of plot, at the end of Act 2, and usually at the end of Act 2, that's the darkest hour. That's the point where everything looks as if it's about to collapse and crash. The whole thing is falling apart. And then you get that little glimmer of light, that chance. In the old Western movies, that was when the cavalry started to arrive. And we go into Act 3, and Act 3 is where we get to the resolution. The problem is solved, and we come out of that with the end of our story. And most people like a good ending to the story. Bad endings, people try them, but we actually like to feel a sense of completion, a sense that everything actually turned out okay. I know it's the happy ever after ending, but to be honest, we prefer happy ever happy ever after for our stories. It gives us some hope that our own lives are going to be happy ever after. I'm just checking a few little notes to get myself in the right order here. So that's it. In Act 3, we're coming to the climax and then the resolution and everything's sorted out. Now, there's a poem which I love, and I'm going to recite this because I love doing poetry, and what I'm going to do tomorrow is a little bit of just pure poetry. Poetry is great for anybody wanting to develop their speaking skills, because the first thing is you're learning the words. Somebody has spent months, years crafting a particular poem, even if it's a few lines, just to make them really, really work. So you know that the text is very, very well written. It's not just off the cuff. And by learning a poem, you can learn to perform it. And we know I've talked about passion, experience, purpose, performance. When it comes to performance, I find working with poetry is an extraordinarily good way to develop your performance skills, because you haven't got to worry about what you're going to say. You know what's going to happen. You're just thinking about, how do I put this across in the way that conveys its meaning best to the audience. And you pick poems that you like. I'm not talking about picking poems that you find boring. You pick poems that actually inspire you, that work for you. And that's what I do. If I come across a poem, I read hundreds of poems, and I'll come across a couple I think, I really like that, and it's funny, or it's dramatic, or it's good. And this one's one you'll know, but it enables you to summarise and encapsulate the whole 3-act process, the whole storytelling process. But it shows that it's not about often not about the content, it's about the structure. And the poem is a Jabberwocky, which is a nonsense poem. So if you think, oh my God, I don't understand all this because all the words don't mean anything, you're right, they don't. It's absolute nonsense. So here's the Jabberwocky, and I'm just going to interject where the various points are for the 3-act structure. So think about the Jabberwocky poem, and you'll be able to remember the whole way in which a good story can be structured. It's not the only way, but this is a sort of a model, a template on which you can work around. 'Twas brillig, and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe. All mimsy were the borogoves, and the mome raths outgrabe the setting, bit of eeriness around it. Beware the Jabberwock, my son, with jaws that bite and claws that snatch. Beware the jump bird, and shun the frumious brandersnatch. That's our call to action. Act 1 is finished, and we're off into the programme. He took his vorpal sword in hand. Long time the manxome foe he sought. Then rested he by a tumtum tree, and stood a while in thought. This is our Act 2, constantly battling, trying to find the antagonist. But while in offish thought he stood, the Jabberwock with eyes aflame came whiffling through the tulgey wood and burbled as he came. We're heading up to the climax. The confrontation is now about to happen. He's got to face this villain. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1 through. The vorpal blade went snicker-snack. He left it dead, and with its head he went galumphing home. The near-death experience, the climax over, he's won. Oh, and hast thou slain the Jabberwock? Oh, come to my arms, my beamish boy. Oh, rapturous day, Callooh Callay, he chuckled in his joy. The resolution, his return, the conquering hero. 'Twas brillig, and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe. All mimsy were the borogoves, and the mome raths outgrabe. That last verse repeats the first verse. We're back. The world hasn't really changed much. It still goes on the same as it was, but our antagonist has changed. So our protagonist has changed. And that's the essence of a good story. Nothing much actually changes as we go through the story. We come back and everything goes back the way it was. But the people, as a result of the experience of going through that story, have learnt their lessons and have come out, and they have grown and changed and transformed. And that's exactly what you're trying to achieve with your story. Either you or your customer, whoever becomes the protagonist, will go through a process of change as they go through that story. And I hope the Jabberwocky will now remind you every time about how to construct a great story. Talk to you tomorrow.